Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Koji and I'm going to be doing another sword review. The sword I'm going to be reviewing in this video is going to be the Ryujin Practice Unsharpened Iaito Katana. Now for those of you who have already seen my previous video, you'll note that I've already done a video on this sword. However, in that video I was comparing this sword to a similar sword made by another more well-known sword manufacturer by the name of Hanwei. But before I moved on to other swords in my collection, I wanted to make sure that this sword had its own independent review and scored based on its own characteristics and features. But again, since I've already made a video on the sword where I've already gone into great detail about the sword, I'm going to make this review really short. First off, Ryujin Swords is a sword manufacturer which is a division of Top Quest Incorporated and is owned and directed by a Mr. Samsung, who is actually one of the original founders of another sword manufacturing company by the name of Musashi Swords, but has since then been a driving force in the sword industry. This sword retails for $119. Now that doesn't include shipping costs and is distributed through Swords at Armory. You can buy this sword either through Swords at Armory's website or on eBay through Swords at Armory. Links to both of those listings will be in the description below. This Ryujin sword, without the scabbard, measures at 40 inches long and comes in at 2 pounds and 4 ounces. The blade is a differentially hardened 65 MN spring steel blade with a real hamon, not a filed-on hamon, and not a hamon that's artificially applied using a harsh acidic chemical, a real hamon. As we move down to the handle, the tsuba or handle guard is actually a 1045 blackened carbon steel tsuba, which is quite impressive, and it is in fact quite ornate, with one side having a dragon and the other side having what I can only imagine is Mount Fuji. The sword handle is wrapped with a simple cording. I don't think it's cotton, but it's definitely not polyester, so it is pretty comfortable to hold, but it does have real rayskin and brass manuki. Now there are 5 things I really want to cover with this particular sword. First one being the price. Normally when I think about swords for around $100 to $125, I usually think of 1045 carbon steel, which may or may not be differentially hardened, an imitation hamon that's either been most likely filed on or no hamon at all, a stainless steel or alloyed tsuba, a cotton or polyester wrapped handle, and generally imitation rayskin. So the materials used in the creation of the sword has already surpassed my expectation for what you can get for $100. But that brings us to the second thing I want to cover, is the build quality. And while having a differentially hardened spring steel blade with a real hamon, 1045 carbon steel fittings, and real rayskin is quite impressive, there's still quite a few things you need to come to expect when spending $100 on a katana. The first thing I want to point out is the cord wrapping on the handle. It's not that tightly wrapped, and in fact it is mostly held onto the handle by glue. And after a few months of purchasing the sword and using it for training every day, the glue started to give way and has actually caused the cording to actually slide up and down the handle, actually revealing the wood of the handle and the fact that it's actually rayskin panels and not actually wrapped around the entire handle. However, one of the things that I was working on at the time of purchasing this sword was my overall handling and gripping of the katana handle, which has since then improved, and as a result I have experienced less movement of the cord on the handle, and because of that I'm willing to let that slide. Now let's move on to the blade. One of the things that I've noticed about the blade is it has some imperfections. While it looks good from a distance, one of the things I've come to notice on the blade is it had a divot on the spine of the blade, which is mostly a cosmetic error, but an error nonetheless. However, once again, it is something that you come to expect when spending $100 on a katana. The other thing I want to bring up is the fact that it's made of 65 MN spring steel. For those of you who are not familiar with 65 MN steel, it is actually used for making things actually like springs, hence a spring steel blade, but it is also used for making other tools such as machetes. It is also worth noting that 65 MN steel actually has a very, very low corrosion resistance. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because in my previous video, I had said that both this sword and the Hanwei sword had maintenance-free blades. I misspoke. The Hanwei sword has a maintenance-free blade. This one, on the other hand, has a blade that I would highly recommend regular care and maintenance. But staying with the blade, we're going to move on to point number 3, and that is the sword's sharpness. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why am I concerned about a sword's sharpness when it's marketed as a blunt and unsharpened training sword? Well, that is because this sword is only 95 to 98% blunt. And what I mean by that, the sword is blunt only all the way up until here, which actually has a razor sharp tip and a very, very fine point. Now, how sharp are you wondering? This sharp. I cannot do that with my other unsharpened training swords. However, the Hanwei is a different story, and I'll address that in its own review. Now, the fourth thing I want to address about this sword is the weight. This sword weighs in at 2 pounds and 4 ounces, and it's actually the heaviest of my training katanas. Now, my most balanced training katana comes in at exactly 2 pounds, meaning that there's only a 4-ounce difference between the two. Why is that? Well, that is due to the lack of a bohi or tapering on this blade. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with a bohi, that is the groove or gutter that runs down the spine of some katanas, and that serves a couple of functions. One is to reduce rigidity in the blade, and 2 is to actually reduce the weight of the blade by removing metal from it. The other thing that I mentioned was tapering. This sword doesn't actually taper very much. In fact, it kind of holds its width, pretty much the entire length, until about around here where it really starts to taper, but not very much, which means again that there's more metal on the blade. And as a result, that means the Ryujin sword is actually more blade heavy than a more well-balanced katana. So what that means is the center of balance of the sword is actually around here versus around here, which would be more ideal, but as a result, it creates the illusion that the sword is actually much more heavier than another sword of a similar or same weight class. Now, the fifth and final thing I want to talk about this sword is the way that it draws. It is smooth, buttery smooth. And if you're somebody who practices Iaito or Bato or some form of Bato Jutsu, you've probably come to appreciate a smooth drawing sword, which this sword does very well, in fact. And that is my review for the Ryujin Practice Iaito Katana. Now, I really like this sword, but if I was to score it, I probably would have given it a 6 out of 10. But because this sword is so cheap to obtain and is actually really good quality for the price, I'm going to bump it up to a 7 out of 10. However, this score is subjective to change. In the event that I find a superior sword that is more well-balanced, well-constructed, and within the same price range, I will in fact bump this score back down to a 6. But that is all I have for this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch it. I greatly appreciate it. And like I hinted to earlier in this video, I do have an independent review coming for the Hanwei equivalent to this sword, which I had previously compared it to in a previous video. And if that's something that you're interested in, probably consider subscribing to the channel. But until then, practice hard, train safe, have fun, and I hope to see you in the next video.